Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a few housekeeping hints before we start this morning. If you've got any other streaming devices anywhere near you, it's a good idea to actually get those turned off, otherwise it can actually interrupt with the signal strength and you may not get the best out of the webinar this morning. Other than that, if you can do a quick sound test, make sure you can hear us. We'll ask you to raise your hand in a few moments if you can, but if you can set your own volume controls. And hopefully you have a dashboard in front of you which has the various icons. If you would like to ask a question at any stage, please either type a question into the dashboard and it'll come up in front of us and we'll answer that. Or alternatively, if you'd like to come on air and ask your question, then raise your hand at the appropriate time, and if we can, we'll come to you and we'll unmute your microphone. But other than that, we're ready to go. So as I say, welcome to the webinar this morning. Head Teacher Recruitment is the focus of this morning's webinar. I'm Steve Barker and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning.
Good morning.
And the aims of today's session are to explore several of the issues around head teacher recruitment. Firstly, thinking about the initial steps for governing boards when they know they have a vacancy. And in fact, just before we touch on that, we might look slightly broader at the issue of head teacher recruitment, even before we know we've got a vacancy, when we think we might have one. We'll also look at the role of the recruitment panel and how they should actually be appointed, and considering some of the issues around what does effective planning and hopefully final selection appointment actually look like within this process. So it is your session this morning, so please do feel free at any stage to ask us any questions, make any comments, etc.
So we're looking at the national context. There are patches of difference across the country, of course there are, and you will need to know a little bit about your local area, possibly from the way in which this has been reported by your local press, by your local authority, or the challenges if you're within a MAT. But there are major challenges across the country with the recruitment of senior leaders, head teachers in most schools. Some of this is anecdotal, as I say, some local areas. It is patchy. Some may have very good results at parts of the year to the advertisements around head teachers, and others have to go a number of times out to advert in order to get a reasonable group of people to go to interview with. And of course, there is the huge cost that this multiple advertising tends to have on the school budgets. And school budgets, as you know at the moment, are really struggling in order to pay for the things that they need to pay for. So although numbers are going up, the amounts of costs that they have are increasing all the time. Richard has asked a question about what are MATs. And for those of you that work in a single school, either as a single school academy or a school that's maintained by the local authority, a MAT is a multi-academy trust, and this is where a group of schools operate under a single accountable board called a trust board, and often they have a different approach to recruiting and deploying head teachers. So they may have an approach in the larger trusts where they might be looking at head teachers who are deployed around or appointed by the trust itself. So it's very different, and a very different pattern. So the other difficulties that we look at are those with of small schools. So small schools, there is a link to how much you can pay your head teacher to the number of pupils you have on roll. So clearly with a small school, a smaller role, you are limited by the amount of money you can offer your head teacher in terms of salary. And then with schools of religious character, there are different requirements in terms of their religious background as an individual and simply the pool of people who fit that ethos for those types of schools. So again, these become pulling from a smaller pool, so the difficulties increase.
So the next question really comes back to the comment I made in the introduction about perhaps a slightly broader context of head teacher recruitment. And the question really is, when do you start thinking about your next school leader? And certainly our perspective is that it shouldn't be the first time you actually know that your head teacher is actually going to resign when they hand a letter in to you, if you're the chair of the governing body. The whole idea of succession planning or leadership development, whatever we want to call it, ought to be on the governing body or the governing board's agenda, certainly from the moment you recruit a head teacher, I would say. It's about thinking, well, when is this likely to happen? What are we doing as a school, as a standalone academy, as a multi-academy trust, in order to ensure that perhaps we're either growing our own candidates or actually developing individuals who can go on and be candidates elsewhere. Because certainly one of the facets of the education system, of course, is that schools can take pride on actually growing people's potential so that they are ready to take on leadership roles, and very often those will be in other schools. So thinking about who the next school leader is likely to be, or certainly when we're likely to be in a position when we might need to think about our next school leader, is something that should be on the agenda for most of us. And there are opportunities. It's not a taboo subject, or it certainly shouldn't be a taboo subject. Certainly in a head teacher appraisal, talking about future intentions ought to be on the agenda. It's not something that you necessarily can expect people to commit to 100%, but for people to give an idea when they might perhaps be thinking about moving on to a larger school, to a different setting, or even when they might be thinking about retiring. There's no commitment here, but it does give governing bodies, governing boards a little bit of a heads up in terms of what they might be wanting to consider.
The other thing I would say there, it's also about the culture of your school or multi-academy trusts. So if you are developing individuals further down the school, this is all part of that culture of succession planning and developing leadership potential, either in your own pool or for the wider pool outside.
So we've actually got an opinion poll that we'd like to launch at this stage, which is looking at this specific aspect of what the governing body actually talks about and when it has that discussion, etc. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and hopefully that should be appearing on your screens at this moment. And if we could ask you to respond, and see several people are already, that's great. Question there, as you can see, is has your governing body had a discussion about when your head teacher is likely to resign? And we've got quite a lot of people who have actually voted already. We're almost at 90%, so we'll just give you a couple more moments for those people that haven't yet voted to take that opportunity. And we're creeping up. Everybody has just about voted now. So I'm going to close the poll now, and we'll actually share those results with you. And you should be able to see that bar chart on your screen now. And as you can see, 55% of you have said, yes, you've already had that discussion. That's great news. That's exactly, hopefully the discussion hasn't been a consequence of a head teacher telling you they're going. It should be more of a planned event than that. Just over a third haven't, and 10% of you don't know. Well, certainly I think the view from Linda and I this morning would be that this is something that should be talked about. Not just dropped into a conversation in the governing body meeting, but perhaps as a scheduled conversation at some stage in the not too distant future. One or two comments coming through that several of you have actually had a discussion in the head teachers pay review panel. That's absolutely fine, as long as this doesn't come as a complete bolt out of the blue. I'm a great believer in the culture of no surprises when it comes to all aspects of governance, and I think this is a classic example where it shouldn't come as a surprise just when head teachers do actually think about resignation.
Many head teachers will give a very long lead-in of their intention, so they may not put their formal resignation in as the sort of first and only point of conversation, but they'll often give a very long lead-in period so that there's plenty of opportunity to look at what the shape of leadership might be to replace them in the future, because things have changed quite a lot since possibly they've been in post.
Okay, and on that front, we've got a question here from Patrick. or question, it's a statement rather than a question, I guess. My head teacher said in a one-to-one conversation that their intention is to resign at Christmas, or to retire at Christmas, sorry, but doesn't want it common knowledge with the governing body. That's possibly not that unusual. I would suggest that there is an appropriate conversation to be had between you, Patrick, and your head teacher that says this needs to be widened out to a slightly larger. We're already in the latter part of the summer term now. You need to be thinking about, if she's going, or she or he are going at Christmas, you need to be thinking about advertising very, very early in the autumn term. So this is something that the governing body has to plan for. Most schools would find it very difficult, again, I don't know your particular circumstances, but would find it very difficult to operate without a head teacher unless there's somebody who can step up into an interim position. So, you've got a very short lead time already of someone saying they're going at Christmas. Yes, fully understand the personal aspects of not wanting it to destabilise staff, parents, all of those things, but there is a bigger picture here in terms of leadership of the school.
And the other thing about knowing in advance that your head teacher is going and being able to plan for it is that the pool is bigger for a September start. So if you are looking for a head at other times of the year, it just makes an already difficult situation more difficult again.
Okay, so let's move on at that stage. So when you actually get a letter, if you're the chair, or if you hear that your chair has had a letter from the head teacher confirming their resignation, it does actually present an opportunity to think about, as governing boards, what do we want that future to look like? And this again is not a knee-jerk reaction, or it shouldn't be, and this is why it's important to really, if we can, to have an understanding of what our head teacher's intentions are with a slightly longer lead time or lead into this, because it may not be that we're going as a governing body for a like-for-like replacement. Head teacher resigns, we'll replace with another head teacher. The opportunities now are to think about structure, to think about organisation, to think about what's best for the school, given its context at this point in time. And Linda's already talked about financial considerations. That's leading a lot of schools now, particularly small ones, to think about the affordability of that structure.
And there are other issues here in terms of what your structure of leadership looks across the school. If it's a school that is growing and expanding, then you might be looking at a slightly different shape to the leadership team itself. So this may be an opportunity to look at a wide, look at it in a deeper way, to think around what the needs of the school are strategically for the future.
And on that front, Ian, forgive me, I wasn't ignoring your question earlier, but I knew this slide was coming up, so it made more sense to answer it here. Ian's asked a question, can we say something about co-headship? Our position is that the current head teacher has indicated an intention to retire 2020-2021, currently have 2 deputies, and they've approached the chair, Ian, as chair to ask if governors will consider co-headship. Co-headship is, it's not unusual, it's rare, but it does happen. In fact, one of my schools where I'm actually chair, we've had a co-principal or co-headship model for the last 5 years now, and it's worked incredibly successfully. There are probably about 5 or 6 similar schools with that co-headship model in the local authority that Linda and I are governors in. It's not an unusual model, and it's a decision for governors to take. Very often, coming back to Linda's last point, it's about, is that right for the school? Because very often a co-headship model, unless it's on a job share basis, that they're working sort of 50% FTE each, will have a cost implication, of course. But if that in itself leads to an opportunity to restructure the rest of the leadership team and is affordable, it is most certainly a model that has been seen to work very, very effectively in certain schools.
In terms of a succession planning model, there's also a school that we have within our local authority area that has used the deputy head as part of her time has been as co-head. And the head teacher has reduced her working hours so that she's taking partial retirement, leading to full-time retirement, with that co-head stepping up full-time when she leaves. So it's about having that conversation strategically about what is right for the school itself, rather than shaping your strategic conversations around the needs of individuals. And whilst we would want to make sure that we are flexible in making a very fair and reasonable approach to somebody's request for this kind of leadership, we do need to think clearly about what will be in the best interests of the current pupils and the future of the school.
And that's why the 5 bullet points, that we have on this slide really are options. It's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. There are others as well. Lots of schools now look at executive leadership, not just because it's within an academy trust situation, although that could be one of the reasons, but executive head teachers across a number of schools, again, tends to be linked with the bullet point underneath that of a head of school as opposed to a head teacher. It's considered to be a slightly more cost-effective way of doing it, but it can create a very robust leadership model. And a question here from Anne: if a co-head or head of school is ready to take on headship, do we still have to advertise? If you're in a maintained school, Anne, it's a good question to ask. If you're in a maintained school, the regulations say that the governing body should advertise a vacancy unless they have good reason not to. Now, I would suggest you can actually, thanks Anne, you've confirmed it is a maintained school. So for me, I would say it's about the governing body actually rehearsing that in a meeting, making sure it's in your minutes just in case anybody ever questions it. But if you've actually got a co-headship model, it would depend on the contracts that were negotiated at the time, or you've got an individual as a head of school and they're ready to step up. It would be a little bit disingenuous to advertise if you know you're going to give them the job anyway. It's not fair on other candidates, and you have to be mindful that there will be fallout if they're not the person that's appointed. But again, it's the needs of the school which are paramount. If they're the right person for your school, to my mind, and Linda's actually nodding at me now, to my mind, that's good reason not to advertise.
The other thing I would say in that model is when you're entering that model, this slide at the moment that's on the screen, this is about thinking as you would if you were procuring anything in your school about what it is you need and what are the risk factors of the decisions that you make. So if you're taking somebody on who has unproven or developing talent, what is it that you need to make sure they have access to in terms of mentoring, support, development, and the measures with which you will judge their success? So these things all need to be built into part of that process, particularly if you are changing the model of leadership within your school, because there will be resistance and you will need to take into account all of the factors that might undo you if it doesn't work successfully.
Absolutely. And the last two options here, Federation or Multi-Academy Trust, again, it's just making that point that if there is about to be a change in the leadership right at the very top of the senior leadership team of the school, that is an opportunity to think about the structure going forward. And one option in terms of schools working closer together is, of course, federation. For those of you that aren't 100% certain on this, federation is when two schools federate under a single governing body. Now, the significance of that here, so it's a governing body governing more than one school. I said two, it can be, but three, it can be more than that. But when governing bodies come together and federate, very often that also leads to an executive head teacher position across a number of schools. And again, that can have an impact. And of course, the other option is it remains that you join a multi-academy trust. It is very rare, if not impossible, to set up your own trust anymore. It's not necessarily 100% unheard of, but it is a rarity. So for the most part now, the opportunity is to consider, does your school want to join an existing multi-academy trust as an alternative to going out and recruiting?
And certainly schools that have found it difficult to recruit do look at this as a possibility, and there are some examples, particularly in the West Country, where multi-academy trusts actively and federations have actively applied for a post that's been advertised for head teacher.
And again, don't forget, it's not actually on the slide here, but something else to think about. I think Linda and I would always say, and I know a lot of my HR colleagues would say, it's better not to appoint than it is to actually appoint the wrong candidate. So, If you don't appoint, that's not the end of the earth. What you could do is have an interim position or a temporary head teacher. That might be asking somebody in your school to step up, or actually bringing somebody in from external to the school to actually act as head teacher for a period of time while you perhaps reflect on your options, or perhaps just consider going back out to the market again. So we have got some DfE guidance on this. And the DfE guidance was published in 2017. It's relatively short and concise, but I would always advocate that if your school thinks it's about to be in a situation where you're recruiting a head teacher, or you know you're going to be recruiting a head teacher, you really should look at this guidance, because there are aspects in here which apply to all schools, whether you're an academy or a maintained school. And certainly there are some very helpful pointers to areas of compliance with statutory regulations, etc., as well as good practice. But the statutory compliance is something that, as governing bodies, and certainly as the panels we appoint, very, very important that we actually are mindful of equalities legislation, that we're mindful of safer recruitment regulation, etc. as well. So if you are on a panel, if you're chairing a panel, absolutely crucial that you make reference to that particular guidance. We've got a question here from Karen. If your school has been reviewing joining an academy and receive head teacher notice, how do you proceed as governors? I think if the two are unrelated, then I think the governing body should actually be reflecting on, are they making the right decision? If the head teacher was going to was actually considering retiring or resigning anyway, then I think that shouldn't actually alter the process. The decision to join an academy is the governing body's to make, assuming, of course, you're not in an Ofsted category. And academies will do due diligence, but actually, Academy Trust will do due diligence, but actually as a school, you should go through that process as well. So the governors need to be assured that this is the right decision for them. Now, it is absolutely the right decision for an awful lot, but some don't feel it is. But there needs to be an open, frank, honest and transparent discussion, dialogue going on, so that governors can make an informed decision about what is in the best interests of the pupils in your school and your school communities. Okay, so let's just move on. Just a quick reminder, this is a bit of a placeholder apart from anything else. Resignation dates, as Linda alluded earlier, most vacancies tend to actually come up for the beginning of an academic year, and that's just head teachers really thinking about what's in the best interest of the school, route of least disruption, etc. But there are 3 occasions during the year when existing head teachers can actually resign. But of course, we might not be recruiting someone who's already a serving head, so we need to be mindful of what perhaps serving deputies have to give in terms of notice. And for this purpose of this slide, deputies are treated in exactly the same way as all other teaching staff, so their resignation dates are the same as for all other teachers. But head teachers, their dates, as you'll see, tend to be a month earlier. So for them, it's it's not just a half term, it's actually a full 3 months prior. So the next resignation date for a head teacher, and again, some head teachers are very, very thoughtful and give governors a lot of notice of their intention, but the next resignation date now is the 30th of September, and that's with a view to that person leaving at Christmas, and the vacancy obviously being available to be filled from the 1st of January. So as I say, that's just a little bit of a reference slide for you there.
So when you're looking at moving forward into actually making the recruitment a live issue in your school, then there are some considerations that you need to understand ahead of doing that. So as Steve has already said, safer recruitment practices are absolutely essential. You're bringing somebody into your school who is going to lead effective safeguarding in your context, and you as a governing board, you need to ensure that all of the safer recruitment practices and processes are followed absolutely, and that you have the evidence to show that that has been done. You need to also make reference to any protocols or succession planning documents that you have in place in your school, because your policies and your protocols or your organisational rules. So you need to follow those first and foremost, because again, you are bound to be compliant with anything that you have put in place to operate within your setting. And if you are a maintained school, you will need to let your local authority know, again, with as much notice as possible. This isn't as it's going to be shared broad and wide, but that the local authority is aware and can support you and advise you. And the same if you're a school with religious character, your diocese will need to be involved. And if you're a multi-academy trust, then you need to give notice to and consult with your trust board, because in multi-academy trusts, the way in which head teacher recruitment is handled and at what level can be very different trust to trust. You need to look at who you buy your personnel advice from, and the SLA or the agreement that you have in place as to how they will be involved, what level of support they will be offering. You need to consider the costs of that. You can't say I'm not going to have it, but there will be a cost implication in almost all cases, and therefore the extent to which you might shape the head teacher recruitment process and how broad that process is. There may be elements of cost that you will need to scope in or scope out of that process. And you'll also need to think about how that new head teacher, depending on the expertise and experience that they bring with them, is trained at continual professional development. What does that look like for the first 2 years of headship? And looking back at your protocols and your documentation, your trust expectations, if you're in a multi-academy trust, what kind of mentorship, what kind of support will they get on a week-by-week basis, particularly if they are a brand new head in post.
And I think all of these considerations are relevant, let's say, in all settings, but also we need to be mindful of things like the competency framework for governance. The expectation that the Department for Education has is that all governing bodies do actually contain individuals who've got those competencies that do relate to effective leadership of staffing, and that includes recruitment, of course. So making sure that not just you, because you've actually participated in this webinar this morning, but perhaps your colleagues who might be joining you if a panel is being put together in your school, have they had appropriate training? Just because you have experience of recruitment in the wider world beyond education, it doesn't mean to say that you're unnecessarily aware of some of the regulations that are relevant in recruitment of a head teacher. And
you will need somebody on your board who has been safer recruitment trained, so that they have gone through that formal process and have that certification to say that they understand what the role of the board is. Because normally on a board for appointment in relationship to other appointments within your school, your head teacher or other senior leader on the interview panel will have that safer recruitment badge. For this process of appointing a head teacher, it must be one of the members of the board.
And we've got a couple of examples of where you can go for that training in terms of online provision towards the end of the PowerPoint anyway. So let's move on. We've already mentioned about notifying the local authority and others who may actually be involved in that recruitment process in your school if you're maintained. And again, Linda's actually gone into details of what you would actually do in an academy situation. Of course, the next job is to appoint a selection panel, or a recruitment or selection panel, if that's what we wish to call it. There is an opportunity to actually think about who have got, amongst the members of the governing body or the local academy board or whatever that happens to be, who are the individuals who've got the most appropriate skills to be able to provide the service that the school needs. And I think whilst a lot of people see this as quite an interesting and important role for governors, they don't always think about the time commitment that is going to be involved here. So certainly if you're the chair or if you're somebody who's going to be involved in actually arranging who the panel is, or perhaps leading the appointment of the panel, I would suggest it's good practice to ensure that everybody understands that there's quite a bit of time here. There's a lot of planning work that goes in. There's probably at least 2 or 3 meetings I would suggest beforehand. There might be there should be a shortlisting meeting, and those are best done face-to-face. They can be done virtually, but they're best done face-to-face. And then, of course, there's actually the recruitment day or days itself, and that's something that needs to be discussed by the panel. It is not at all unusual for there to be a 2-day selection and recruitment process for head teachers. So we could be talking 3.5, 4 days even. That's a commitment for a lot of us as governors, there's no doubt about that, but you have to be mindful of that, because what you can't have is somebody saying, yes, I want to do it, and then letting their colleagues down by not having the capacity to be able to meet all those commitments when push comes to shove. And question, so that Linda actually put a question up right at the very beginning, and as I was actually doing the setup, apologies Linda, I did actually delete your question, so I couldn't actually respond to it at the time, but I do remember what the question was before I very stupidly actually deleted it. Linda's question was, can a member of staff actually, or a staff governor, sorry I should say rather than a member of staff, can a staff governor participate on a governor's selection panel? Simple answer is yes. They are a governor, all governors are equal. I do think, you know, a little bit of thought needs to be given to potential, not conflict of interest, but potential embarrassment, I would say, more than anything else. Just because you work in the school, there is nothing to say that you cannot be part of the appointment process for your next boss, so to speak. It might be unusual, but it is not at all impossible, and there is nothing in the statutory framework to suggest that. One of the schools where I'm chair, the last 2 appointments of head teachers over the last 10 years or so, we've had a staff governor involved on both. They bring a very valuable perspective in the same way that parents bring a valuable perspective to that selection process.
I think when you're looking at who you're appointing to your panel, you would look at a skill set, but you'll also look at intent in the same way that you do with any other aspect. And if that person has the right intention and the correct set of skills, then it may well be appropriate. You will also need to consider, if you're taking them out of their teaching role or their leadership role in school for 4 days, what's the impact on teaching and learning? So there's a whole range of things that you take into consideration.
Anne's got an interesting question here. I've been advised to get someone independent of the school and governing board on the panel, for example, head of another school or local authority. Is this acceptable? And sorry, just to keep track, there's a lot of questions coming in. I think you're the same Anne that said you were in a maintained school before. So I'm assuming this is a maintained school. Sorry, Anne, thank you very much. In a maintained school, there are regulations that cover this, and the panel itself must be made up of governors of the school, and there is no flexibility in that at all. However, that does not preclude any school from bringing in external advice. I mean, Linda's already talked about HR advice. Certainly, a lot of schools would have a school effectiveness, school improvement person from the local authority, possibly from the diocese, etc. there. But the panel itself is only governors, and it's only governors of the school. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying that even if you're an associate member, you are not eligible to sit on a recruitment panel. Yes, because it has to be governors.
You have to have decision-making power in your school, and that is vested in you by the fact that you are an appointed or an elected governor. So if you look at the last bullet point of the current slide, yes, you are required as that selection panel to seek professional advice, because for most of us as governors, we are not education professionals, and we do need to test that person's ability as a potential candidate, that they have the skills required, the educational skills, to be able to lead the school in terms of its teaching and learning. And so you must have some kind of professional advice. Often this is a package that a local authority will broker with you. Again, most things come at a cost these days, or the diocese, or in a multi-academy trust, it may be provided within the trust. But you shouldn't be considering appointing a head teacher without professional expertise. So it may be well to check, Anne, that what you're being offered isn't that professional advice rather than somebody who is sitting on your board as a decision maker because they don't qualify.
And again, taking that point a little bit further, Ian's put a question up here. Suggestion has been made that they have 3 separate panels, one led by the local authority's Director of Education, external advisor, etc. That's fine, Ian, provided, as Linda's just said, those panels inform the decision, but they do not make the decision. So what you would have, you can have anybody, and so you can bring an expert in to chair, if you like, let's not call them a panel, but to chair one of the activities, a group discussion or something like that, which is part of your selection process. That group of people then feed back into the panel, and that informs the panel's decision. But those external advisors can only advise. They cannot make and should not influence the decision directly.
It's a similar sort of thing that we have with head teacher appraisal when we're bringing in the external advisor with that professional advice to help us shape objectives for a head teacher and test whether they've been met. They have that professional educational expertise that we need to refer to as a panel, the same as the HR expertise needs to be referred to. But ultimately, and a local authority will tell you, you make the decision.
Absolutely. And Margaret's come up with a question here. Would you include a staff governor if an internal candidate is applying? Our local authority has advised against it. That's a difficult question, Margaret. I think I would actually want to, as a governor, explore what the relationship was. You don't want somebody on the panel who's coming there as the best friend, or even the opposite of that, as a detractor from that particular individual. But if it's somebody who is, you know, independent, if it's a large school and that person doesn't work with that individual, doesn't have any connection with them, I think you have to be careful about just saying, no, it's not appropriate. There have been instances which I've been aware of in recent years where people have been told, staff governors, teacher governors particularly, that they couldn't be part of the panel, and their union has actually taken up the cause, and it's actually got the school into quite a lot of difficulty. So I think the only reason I would say somebody would be not appropriate to actually sit on a panel is if there was perception of a conflict of interest. So I think there has to be a sensitive conversation about that on a one-to-one basis, including that person, not about that person. Because, as I say, there is no reason why a staff governor can't serve on a panel, but yeah, it makes it difficult, particularly in a small school, if there is an internal candidate.
If you've got a large pool of people to pick from that all got very well demonstrated skills, you might, to avoid the perception of any interest, and if that candidate wasn't appointed, any continued bad feeling possibly, you might not put them as your first choice. But as Steve says, if they meet all the qualities, they don't work directly with that individual, and there's not a large pool from which to pull, then there is nothing in the regulations that says you can't do it.
And realistically, it's no different from saying, well, actually, I'm a parent governor, but I will serve on the panel. That internal candidate may have taught my son or daughter. Yeah, it could be perceived that there is a connection, there could be a favouritism, there could be some animosity. You don't know which way it's going to go. But if you are in that situation, you might want to think, which comes on to our next question about how many governors you have on a panel. I think my guidance would always be to say 3 is a good number, because by the time you've got all of your advisors there as well, you don't want 10 against 1 in an interview situation. That's not very friendly, I don't think, and I'm not sure that actually puts the school in a good light. But if you have a situation where there could be those perceptions, perhaps have 5 people on the panel, or have 4, and make sure the chair has a casting vote. I would always go for an odd number, to be perfectly honest.
I would agree with that. Always an odd number, because then if there is any kind of discussion where you're not all agreed on a single candidate, you will actually get a resolution. The other thing, some schools with religious character, sometimes the diocese can require a number of foundation governors to sit on that panel, and in those circumstances you may end up with 5, because you're getting representation from in a larger number from foundation governors. But again, if you're consulting the diocese early on in this process, they will, and any guidance and protocols that they expect will be clear from the outset.
Okay, let's move on at that stage. So in terms of the panel, and we've had a little bit of discussion there about the numbers that we might want to have, but Second poll that we're going to actually launch this morning is about, whose responsibility is it to actually set up that panel, to create the panel? So I'm going to launch that poll now, and we've given you 3 potential choices there. So if you'd like to cast your vote now, please, we'd be very grateful. People voting very rapidly there, which is good. Okay, so we're just about at the 90% mark now. So if you haven't voted yet and would like to, now's your chance, folks. I'm going to close the poll in just a few moments. Okay, we're going to close that poll now and share those results. So you ought to be able to see the bar chart appearing on your screen in front of you now. And you'll see that an overwhelming majority of people have said it's the whole governing body. Yes, 83% of you, absolutely, it is the whole governing body. Somebody says the clerk. The clerk has a role, of course they do, in terms of perhaps making arrangements, but making arrangements is not the same as making the decision. And the question is who decides. And certainly it is not in the gift of the chair to decide who actually sits on a panel. It should be a decision made by the whole governing body, and as we've already said, it should be about who are the people most appropriate. That might be somebody who's had previous experience of head teacher appointment. It might not be. It might be about availability. It might be about the people who've got the time to actually take this seriously, including ensuring that they actually take part in development training that prepares them for the role. So again, individual decisions based on what's right for your school.
I'm going to defend the chair and the clerk a little bit here by saying that some of that work around who might have the right skill set, who might represent that diversity and equality, so that we get a mixed panel rather than the same people doing the same things on the governing body all the time. So there could be a little bit of preliminary work that the chair and the clerk do together to make a suggestion of who would be the most suitable people to sit on the panel, that the governing board themselves then get the option to discuss and agree.
Absolutely. And one thing to add there, I mean, it seems fairly obvious probably to an awful lot of us, but this did come across my desk as a query, is it, can the outgoing head teacher, who is a governor, be part of the panel? Absolutely not. In no circumstances whatever can that actually be acceptable. Regulations actually prohibit that. So certainly something just to bear in mind, but hopefully it won't actually come up in your schools.
Now, your question around making sure that the panel reflects any clear conflict of interest, separation of duties, that again, I'm kind of alluding to that when I'm saying that the chair and the clerk would think about their knowledge of the governing body and the roles that those people have, both in terms of the business interests, which the clerk would hold, and the chair of governors knowing the life of the school. Then that would be where those recommendations that would go before the board to agree would be taken into consideration. And clearly, if Mrs. Jones, having been selected, then says, well, I've got I understand my friend of many years is likely to apply, then you would also expect, under the Nolan principles, that that person would say, I wouldn't be a suitable person to sit on that panel because I may therefore not be able to be impartial.
And going back to the DFE guidance that we quoted right at the beginning of the session, there is a paragraph on page 17 that actually gives a little bit of insight into this. It says, membership of the panel should be diverse and inclusive to help ensure an equal and fair recruitment process. And then it goes on to say that in choosing members of the panel, boards should consider factors such as conflict of interest. So it's out there. Certainly, it's something that we do need. And of course, interest can be real. They can be perceived, and I think we need to consider that as governors as well. And as Linda says, they can actually change over time.
And Rosemary's asked a question that will come to a number of governing bodies. When you've got a small board and roles do cross over, which is normal, you pick your best group, the most impartial, the most skilled people, and sometimes that may mean that you've got some parameters that you're very clear with when you make sure that board is well trained to deliver their task properly. But you can't reduce everything to zero in a small board, but you get as close to that as you can.
And again, we should never lose sight of this is probably the most important decision a governing body, a governing board ever makes. Therefore, it is important to get the right people sitting around that table. And as Linda said, small schools does present a challenge, but you get the best people you can. Okay, so in terms of the process, there's some things to actually think about here. A candidate pack is something that a lot of people think is perhaps a little bit old hat these days, but what you've got to remember, particularly in the that national context that Linda talked about right at the very beginning about there being a potential shortage of head teacher candidates, you've got to make your school attractive. You've got to sell your school because it's not necessarily a seller's market here. This is actually a market that head teachers now absolutely can choose which schools. They're not desperate for jobs, they can choose which schools they go to. So some kind of pack, and it may be an online document now, but something that actually has certainly an outline of your vision that you're going to recruit against, so that potential candidates can actually check whether they relate to that vision, whether they can identify with it, and whether they think it's something they can actually work with. Something that talks about the ethos of the school, what that looks like, a little bit of its history, bearing in mind that the internet enables people to do a lot of their own research, so there's no need to actually put your latest Ofsted score in there. You can actually put a link to it just for good practice. But think about what needs to be there. It may be that it's actually relatively short, but links to information that's all contained on your website. But to put something together that can be sent out to individual candidates, I think is actually quite important.
I think the other thing here is, does your website sell your school well enough? Because any potential candidate, whether they're coming for a teaching post or a headship post in your school, will look at your school website. And it's always worthwhile to just do a little bit of an online search about what comes up about your school. I worked with a school years ago that had quite a difficult journey. And not only was it difficult for them to recruit teachers, but there was also a local blog about the area which came up quite high on the searching for that area. That was a real put-off to potential candidates. So have a look at what your website says. That's the window to your school. Is it selling a very clear message about your vision and your school as a whole? And then what else comes up about your school that you might need to take into account when you're putting that advert out there?
And again, one of the things that the panel has to think about is how you actually promote this. There are lots of opportunities out there now in terms of online advertising. The traditional route is the Times Education Supplement, the TES. They have a specific package that can be made bespoke to schools. But again, that's not without a cost attached to it. And if you're a school that finds yourself going out to advertise and re-advertise several times, you can be talking of very quickly knocking sort of £50,000 for a recruitment campaign if you're not careful.
And again, if you're a maintained school, talk to your local authority. Again, if you're diocese or match related, talk to those individuals and find out what the current recruitment situation is in your local area. Many local authorities have their own recruitment sites that they have set up to support schools placing adverts. That might be a good place to go. Don't make the mistake of advertising everywhere and blowing your recruitment budget in one go when you may have to go out to advert for a second or third time.
Job profile may seem like an obvious thing to put there, but I have experienced situations in the authority where I'm based where this has actually gone horribly wrong. We've had head teachers recruited and started work, and one particular one that comes to mind is a head teacher actually turned up on the first day. Well, what is that building across the road? And that was the school's children's centre, and that head teacher had not been told that. Presumably it wasn't on the school's website either, but it actually wasn't in the job profile either. That was part of the responsibility. So if there are any links with other schools, if there are any additional elements of provision in your school, they might be on the website, but make sure that the responsibility of those is absolutely clear and outlined in that job profile.
Many schools do offer and this will link, Ian, to your question as well. Many schools, when you place your advert, offer the candidates an opportunity to come in and tour the school and to look at the school on a working day and to get a feel for the culture and the layout of the school. Ian has asked a question around practice in independent schools where chairs of governors might go and look at practice, that person in place to observe them in situ. I've not heard of that happening in the maintained sector. And also, what professional judgments are you going to make, because you are doing this as a chair without anybody with you? So I wouldn't suggest that that's good practice, but certainly bringing in those potential candidates. I think I would be reluctant to interview somebody who hasn't been interested enough in the school to make a visit to see what it looked like and felt like.
I think that, for me, that would absolutely be a deal breaker, there's no doubt at all. John's made a good point. Costs can be reduced by good use of social media in addition to an advertisement. Absolutely. And there are some schools that are quite prolific in terms of their participation in social media. And I think schools that have a good social media presence, be it on Facebook or Twitter or anything else for that matter, absolutely, if you've got enough followers, it's the kind of thing that might actually get out there. And if you've got some key people who can influence that by retweeting or reposting, anything you can do to raise awareness is good, including social media, I would say, John. And
the new DFE free teacher vacancies website does also include the option to advertise for free leadership posts, and that has quite a strong Twitter feed attached to it. So again, all of that social media aspect is good.
And Sarah's asked a question here: who should do the tour of the school with potential candidates? That's an interesting question. It's a very good question, I would say, Sarah. In my view, it is probably not a good idea for the outgoing head teacher to do that. Unconscious bias is something all of us need to be very careful of. And, it's difficult. Let's not lose sight of the fact that it's difficult for a head teacher who has run a school for a number of years to hand over the reins of that to somebody else. And there will be things, there just could be odd comments. I'm not suggesting anybody's going to be unprofessional here. Body language, all of those sort of things can actually be an influence here. So I would suggest outgoing head teachers should not, for all the right reasons, be part of this process at all. And that includes showing people out. I would suggest, if governors are available, it's good for a governor to show them out. Better still, pupils. I don't think it should fall to a member of staff, possibly a member of office staff. But again, what you don't want is a bit of a rumour mill or sort of the gossip factory starting up and saying, oh, well, I didn't like that one. Did you see the colour of his socks, or did you see the colour of her shoes, etc. That's not helpful. Again, we need to be open and transparent in everything that we do. And again, if we're thinking about the bullet points on the side here, clear and transparent shortlisting process. Yes, if when we're shortlisting, we want to know who's been to the school, but we don't want anecdotal feedback from anybody in terms of what the visit to the school is not actually part of the selection process and should not be used as a filtering exercise, in my view. It is actually part of the candidate finding out about the school that they're potentially going to apply for headship in.
And it gets more complicated if you've got an internal candidate. Exactly. So again, I agree with Steve that it could be a mixture of chair and pupils, which I always think is a lovely way to show anybody around a school.
Indeed. Well-planned recruitment day or days. Historically, many head teacher recruitments have actually been run over a 2-day process. I don't make myself universally popular by suggesting this to some of my colleagues in HR. I would always, as a governor, challenge that. Why is it 2 days? Does it need to be 2 days? Do we need to put people through this ridiculous process that actually lasts for 48 hours, or could we actually do it more effectively? And again, that's down to you, but down to all of us as individual governing bodies to actually make those decisions. But of course, there's a cost element here in terms of time, and what we maybe want to think about is having a cut halfway through the process. Do we reduce the field down? Do we actually make a selection of those people we want to carry forward to day 2, to the afternoon, or whatever? Those are considerations as well.
And bringing your skills in from your own expertise There are many highly skilled people on governing boards now who have recruited senior managers in their own fields and can influence and help shape what that recruitment days is going to look like in order to get the best. Asking those questions, challenging, why do we do it this way? What is this meant to achieve? Are all good things in terms of planning these to do the best thing that they can for your school, rather than just accept what you're being told is custom and practice.
And put professional feedback there. It's not just a courtesy, it is an important part of professional development for those candidates that don't get through, to ensure that they do receive professional feedback. Now, ideally, and again, not wishing to offend anybody, professional feedback does not come from governors, it comes from the educational professionals involved. And that's what I've put it at this stage rather than at the end. It may be the last thing that you do, but it is absolutely part of the process. So there should be somebody who is making notes throughout the recruitment day or days themselves, just to ensure that there is sufficient evidence to give feedback, honest and robust feedback to candidates who perhaps don't actually meet the requirement.
Sorry, Steve, and to be developmental, because you want people to think that this is part of their career development, and often deputies will go for interviews in order to prepare themselves better for headship. So this is part of their professional development if they are not appointed. And because we are short of leaders in the system, we want people to feel that they have had good professional feedback that they can take on board and come back to the table when they're a little bit more prepared, or they find the right school. It might just not be the right school for them.
Indeed. Full governing body ratification, again, hopefully everybody is aware of this, but the decision should always be taken, certainly in a maintained school, it must be taken back to the governing body. So normally you'd have a full governing body meeting at the end of the recruitment process, but it is ratification. You have delegated the decision to the selection and recruitment panel. The job of the governing body is not to then pick over the bones of that and to try and actually vicariously re-select, so to speak. So this really should be, I'm not in favour of saying that governing bodies rubber stamp anything, but this should be collecting feedback and hearing about the decision that has been made by that panel who you've delegated responsibility to, and then actually taking that decision. And of course then the offer should formally come after that. So the chair of the panel should then leave the governing body meeting and go and make the job offer, and hopefully come back and everybody's got big smiles on their face because they've actually accepted. I did say we'd come back to this question of safer recruitment towards the end. There are many ways that you can do this. Some local authorities, although not very many anymore, will offer it as face-to-face training. It is not sufficient to just do safeguarding training or safer recruitment training. It has to be training that actually prepares you, is accredited training that prepares you for the role of sitting on a recruitment panel. The NSPCC have got a model which is very, very popular, and again, you can find that on their website. And again, through Strictly Education, which is Better Governor is part of, we have a safer recruitment package as well, and there are many other people out there in the marketplace. So that brings us to the end of what we were going to say this morning, folks, and we are running rather short on time, but if there are any outstanding questions, now's the opportunity. And I see we've got one or two on the dashboard already. Got one here from Catherine. What if the full governing body meeting wants to challenge the choice the panel has made? Come back to that. You've delegated the decision making to the panel. They can't. So the governing body cannot challenge that. They might not like it, they might be disappointed, and again, tends to happen when there's an internal candidate who they think is a nice person, but the role of the panel is to make a decision on who's the best candidate for the school on the day.
I think, Neil, just to clarify, I'm not sure that Steve did say virtually. It is, governing body have to be present and voting. So you are right, it's not an electronic agreement. It is actually a meeting of the panel. When
I did use the word virtually, but that was in connection with the shortlisting. So it is possible. I did put a caveat that saying I don't think it's ideal, but I know it does happen. So everybody gets circulated with the application forms, and then you can have a conference call, or you can actually do it through a chat room facility, etc. But this really is a face-to-face thing, in my view, I think.
And Karen, you're talking about how many members of the panel must have training. I'm assuming you're talking about safer recruitment training. At least one person on any interview panel must have that formal training. So that's at least one governor. Remember, it doesn't matter about the other professionals that you've got attending. It must be one decision maker at least. And my advice would be, on any governing body as a whole, at least 2 people trained at any time is a useful way of making sure you're always prepared.
Indeed. Thank you very much, everybody. There's some lovely comments coming through, so thank you for those. That's kind. And just to say that, I mean, if you haven't signed up to Better Governor, please feel free to do that. We have got lots of articles on there on the subject. There's podcasts, etc., as well for those who are subscribers. But any questions at all at any stage, there's no such thing as a daft question. So make sure you ask your questions. Thank you for asking your questions this morning. They've been very helpful in terms of hopefully making the webinar more interactive. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you again in the near future. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Goodbye.